because I'm from Michigan. I grew up in a 30-year deindustrialization process, basically what I call
Yep.
a 30-year recession. I saw all the factories close around me in my hometown, none of my friends getting decent jobs. And I'd asked my superiors at the time, what do you think about this? We're moving all our capacity out of the US, and they didn't care. They didn't even think about it. It was, I got to get my bonus.
Welcome to Manifold. My guest today is Dan Collins. He is the founder of Tyrell Chemical. He is a graduate of Michigan State University and also attended Tsinghua University in Beijing. He spent 20 years in China, participating in the manufacturing boom there and actually setting up local manufacturing for major U.S. companies, I believe, including General Motors. We are here to talk about U.S.-China trade war, tariffs, manufacturing, supply chain, everything that's in the news recently. Dan, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Steve. Great to be here.
Now, we were just talking about this. You are a Michigander, and you are one of several generations in your family to have attended Michigan State University.
Absolutely.
So now, what the way we say it around here is go green.
Absolutely. My dad went there. I was actually spent as a young child. My dad lived in married housing on campus. So I literally grew up at Michigan State as well, from about 0 to 4 or 5 years old. So
when I first moved here, I was at the University of Oregon, and I moved here to be the vice president for research. And I came here before my family could make the move because they really wanted me to start. And I lived in that married housing, which they've now torn down. But I forgot what the name of that, Spartan Village, or I forgot what it's called. But yeah, so I lived there for, I don't know, 3 or 4 months or something.
So yeah, I still try to get back to Michigan State every year. I love wandering around the campus. One of the most beautiful campuses in the country. So
it is.
Yep.
It's very nice.
Yep.
So let's talk about your experience in China. You, after graduating from Michigan State, was it around 96?
97. Yep. End of 97.
97?
Yep.
Okay. And right away, you went to Tsinghua on an exchange program.
I did.
And for the audience.
Yeah. Michigan State had a deal at the time with Tsinghua University, an exchange program. I was a group of about, I think there was 7 of us that went over from Michigan State. I was supposed to do 1 semester there. Ended up staying there 20 years, which was not part of the plan. But yeah, Tsinghua at the time, people may or may not know, but end of 90s, very few foreigners in China, even less foreign exchange students. I mean, we were in the foreign exchange student dorms. What I did at Tsinghua was I got a really great chance to. They were very focused on bringing in foreign students, and kind of the economic development of China was just about to boom at that time, late 90s. They had previously a lot of inflation issues and things, but they were all those kind of free market reforms were about to take off. And I was studying reform of state-owned enterprise under the dean of the business school at Tsinghua. So I got to do a lot of research there. And yeah, it was a fascinating time, but it was the kind of experience where, I would walk out of the dorm and I would be followed around town, oh my God, there's a foreigner here. What's he doing? It was a different time, at that time. So.
Yeah, so for my audience, probably people know that Tsinghua is one of the most elite universities in China. By some metrics, it's the most elite and possibly the hardest one to get into, similar to Beida, and which are both in Beijing. And I think a very significant fraction of the top leadership of the Chinese government has actually passed through Tsinghua University. So in a way, it's a little more technically focused than Beida. So it's a little bit more like MIT than like Harvard, but in a way, it's kind of like a combination of MIT and Harvard.
Yep. Yeah, Tsinghua, they call it the MIT, and Beida, which is, as you mentioned, down the street, is really like the Harvard, and it's all in that Haidian district. You get one of the most concentrated clusters of brain power in the world. You get into Tsinghua, you're not a joke. I mean, it's like you got to be at the very top echelons in their educational program to get in. So it's not that I was
Right.
there. I got through an exchange program. But yeah, no, that's always impressed by Tsinghua people. Still proud to be associated with it in any way. So also Michigan State, although
Yeah, Michigan State's not bad either.
we're not at
So
Tsinghua levels, but you get out of state. I always said you get out of state what you want. Like you have even some of the world's top professors, and you get out of it what you put into it. Really, you could do anything.
yeah. There's a famous among if you're in academia, there's a thing called the Shanghai ranking,
Mhm.
which is done by I forgot which, probably Shanghai Jiaotong University does it, but it's basically a educational research project where some professors there have created this project where they just gather data on all the universities in the world and then they rank them. And it's very quantitative criteria, like papers in top journals, citations, Nobel prizes. It's very cut and dried how they rank the schools, and and it's not subjective. It's not based on like reputation. It's just based on what the researchers at the school produce. And so Michigan State's usually ranked like right around 100 in the world, something like this. And interestingly, when I first came here, Tsinghua was only ranked like, maybe a little bit above that,
Mhm.
if at all. But now Tsinghua is probably in the top 5 or 10 or 20 in the world, and a lot of
Yep.
Chinese universities have moved up on these very objective rankings. They went from, wow, it's a top university in this country of 1.5 billion people, but it's still ranked at the level of like, oh, a good Big Ten university in the United States. But now it's quite different. Now in those quantitative rankings, a bunch of Chinese schools are now really at the top in the world. So that's a big
Oh yeah.
change in say a roughly 20-year
Well, I
period.
think a lot of those rankings too have traditionally overstated the U.S. schools relative to another. You take a look at Moscow State University, which
Yeah.
produced the Soviet space program. A lot of very high tech accomplishments from their engineering school. Extremely difficult to get into, like Tsinghua, and yet they're like 200 and something. Below some U.S. party schools. I just don't buy some of those rankings, but
Yeah.
absolutely all the China schools have moved way up, which they deserve. I mean, these are not, that I'm sure you're very familiar with the Chinese education system. It's no joke, and it's very it's not easy to get into. So at some of those top schools, and it's only based on your scores. There's not any slush. There's no fluff. I did so many community hours, nobody cared. Hated
Yeah,
your
it's
school.
it's one of the it's one of the places that still, it's basically, in a way, it's so meritocratic it could be considered cruel
Yep. Yep.
because students have to take the Gaokao exam at the end of high school, and that determines what college you go to.
Yep.
And Tsinghua would admit a few thousand kids every year, but those are like literally the few thousand best scoring kids out of about 10 million
Yep.
recently, or maybe a few years back, it would be 15 million or 20 million kids who took the exam.
Yep.
So, it's a very, very select group on very, very hard material. Like if you look at the math problems on the Tsinghua exam, they're actually like math problems that would be on an Olympiad contest in the United States. They're not like the SAT math problems. They're way, way harder.
Right.
And so they really are doing a kind of high ceiling
Right.
measurement of people's ability and also how hard they study, because you really have to study hard to do well in that test.
Absolutely. I had a guy work for me once. He was not from Beijing. He was from Gansu. So there is a little preferential treatment at those top schools for like Beijing people, right? If for the Beijing University, a little bit. But he was from Gansu, and I'm like, oh, you're from Gansu, and you got into Tsinghua. You must have done really well on the Gaokao. He's like, yeah, I was number 2 in the province. I'm like, okay,
Yeah.
that explains why you're so smart.
Yeah. That could be like number 2 out of like 300,000 kids who
Yeah.
sat the exam.
Yeah.
And
Great.
actually, just since you seem to know a lot about this stuff, I'll mention something which most Americans don't know, even the experts. In China, if you're in one of the ethnic minority groups,
Yeah.
so the non-Han, roughly maybe 6% of the population, which includes the Uyghurs
Yep.
in Xinjiang, um, rather than the Uyghurs being discriminated against, they were never subject to the one-child policy,
Right.
and they get very, very strong affirmative action to get into the top universities.
Correct.
So the score you need to achieve as a Uyghur to go to Tsinghua or Beida is not nearly as high
Right.
as what the ordinary Han kid, either from Beijing or from Gansu, would have to get in. So there is very strong, in a way, favoritism toward these ethnic minorities
Yep.
in China, which, like I think in the usual narrative in the U.S., the idea is that they're heavily discriminated against, but it's actually the opposite.
Yeah, I would recommend anybody go to Urumqi, and Urumqi has become a capital. It's literally the most developed city in all of Central Asia, which is kind of shocking because 30 years ago, 50 years ago, you're talking complete backwater. I mean, you're talking, camels and little bazaars and sheep herders, and now it's modern industrialized city. There's car plants, solar panel manufacturing plants. It's heavily industrialized in a geography that's basically in the middle of nowhere. You go from Beijing to Urumqi, it's thousands of kilometers. So.
If you study the engineering of what they had to do to bring power supplies, 5G access, all of that stuff to places like Tibet or Xinjiang, the government spent, and also even just roads, like good roads.
Right.
The government spent unbelievable amounts of money to develop those far western regions of China. And, if you're cynical, you could say, oh, they had to do that because otherwise they would have unrest if those areas were not developed. But for whatever reason, those are far more developed than the non-Chinese countries just across the border.
Absolutely.
Because of that resource investment.
It's night and
exactly.
Day. Well, that's a whole subject we get into. I was always very impressed with the CPC. They had a rough start, I would say, post WW2. Of course, they were able to organize, but they started to figure it out in terms of basic practical economic development, because they were pushed so far. They had cadres in every little city and village, listening to people, trying to figure out what would work. And then when they went from the Soviet command and control model started to break down clearly in the 90s when the Soviet Union collapsed, they kind of saw that and then moved farther towards this, which we could talk about. We're talking about tariffs, but what I call the East Asian Economic Development Model, which was based off Japan, South Korea. Not a lot of people remember that South Korea, you go back to the 50s and 60s, it was sub-Saharan level of poverty, sub-Saharan Africa level of poverty. I worked with some Korean guys who'd be about 70 now, but they told me, Dan, you got to understand, when I grew up, I was hungry. I didn't have food. So that's what East Asia rose up out of. And what China basically did, if you look at the big scope of things, started with the command and control, complete central planning, didn't work. It could marshal redevelopment after the wars, World War II. That also worked in the Soviet Union, but then it flatlines. And then when they so they kept their command and control backbone. Oil and gas is nationalized, banking is nationalized, some heavy industry is nationalized. But then layered on top of that, they created the most hyper-competitive private enterprises in the world. So all of this ecosystem is functioning together. And a lot of that private system is based off the East Asian economic model, which is export-led development, capital accumulation, right? And then human bringing up the human index. So how did we do that? So in China, when I went there, 98, 5% of people got a university degree. I think that number is now north of 50%. And you can literally, maybe getting towards 60. If you look at East Asia, Korea, Japan, you could expect China to go to 70% plus, in university degrees at some point. So yeah, you saw, I lived through this. I saw the generations, the dad was a steel worker. The son gets an engineering degree, and they just keep rising up. The human capital index improves. So, if you want to get into tariffs, we can pivot there now, but that's where we're at. So yeah, I lived through this whole, what I call the most rapid ascent of any society in the history of the world. It was,
Yeah.
obvious.
Let's stick on this topic a little bit, because I think even people who think they know about China or East Asian development generally don't understand this, especially if you're not as old as you and I are. You wouldn't really know this because it's all kind of in the history books for a 30-year-old person today. So just to focus on HDI, Human Development Index, if you look at height, so the height of a 19-year-old kid
Right.
in countries like South Korea or in China, through that period of development, when people grow up hungry, and it's a big deal to even get some meat. See, Americans can't understand this, but at the time when you or maybe just before you went to China, people would be lucky to get some meat to eat every week. Right. So just imagine that if you're an American. And same thing in South Korea right after the Korean War, they were desperately poor. So what that does is stunt your growth. And even in Taiwan, the younger generation is much taller than the people that were born 30, 40 years ago.
Right.
We just completed a genetics study in Taiwan using the Taiwan Biobank. And one of the interesting things is we could document that the genetics of height have not changed in Taiwan, but the average height has gone up several inches just because people got richer. They can eat more calories when they're growing up. They get more calcium. They get more protein. Everything changes.
Right.
And now I just looked at some numbers, and the average 19-year-old in China is taller than the average Italian.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I believe
Europe.
that. Yeah.
Yeah. So you just see this crazy thing where, like, among old people, you see very few tall people, but then among young kids, you see a lot of kids that are over 6 feet tall.
Sure. Well, in the 2000, it was the 90s or the 2000s, China had to redesign the city buses because they had to make them taller.
Yes.
So to your point, people are, it makes sense. And really you're talking post 1980, most of Asia was desperately poor. And not a lot of people understand as well is that East Asia, we're talking Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, these tiger economies, as they were called at the time, Hong Kong. These guys were desperately poor and developed under military dictatorships through this export-led development model. Now, the problem we get into with trade is that they're still doing the export development-led model, and it's creating a lot of issues with the states. So, but
let me mention two other things about development and human development. So I was just talking about nutrition. You mentioned already that at the time that you went to China in the 90s, only 5% of high school students were able to go to college, or 5% of 19-year-olds were able to go to college. And now it's well over 50%. So if you think about that, that's a 10x. So if you were a smart kid in China in 1990 or 1995, and you wanted to learn to be a semiconductor engineer, you were probably out of luck because unless you were really at the tippy top in that society, you were not allowed to go to college. There just weren't enough resources for you to get trained. So now you have a 10x within that society. You have a 10x in the fraction of the 19-year-olds who can go and learn how to do machine learning programming or semiconductor development or mechanical engineering, whatever it is. Now you're at developed world levels of human capital development. And that has come as a shock even to American scientists and researchers, because they were used to this idea that, like, China's this huge country, but they send a lot of their people here for graduate school and stuff. So we're used to, like, that level of human capital flow, but they don't realize that a 10x happened. A 10x happened in the pool, just as you've outlined, from 5% to 50%. A 10x happened in the pool, and all of a sudden they're just awash in really, really smart, well-trained 25-year-olds, which just wasn't the case in the 1990s. So an environment where you had to copy everything, you didn't have any strong tradition of world-class engineering or world-class science or chemistry, whatever, you just didn't have it in 1990 or 1995. Now, all of a sudden, you have it for the first time. You have it, and you have it at this crazy scale where every year they're turning out about 10 times as many scientists and engineering grads as the United States, or roughly equivalent to the rest of the world, actually combined. So it's that delta has not been incorporated into people's thinking about what the U.S. is actually competing against right now.
Absolutely.
And the other thing you said, which I want to emphasize, is that all these Asian tigers went through an authoritarian phase where if you want to like bulldoze somebody's farm because we need it for, an airport tarmac, or we need it for a superhighway, that it's much easier if the authoritarian just says, look, this is our economic development plan. We're doing this to you. There's no courts that are going to protect you. We're just going to do it. We're going to move you over there. And maybe it's terrible for that individual farmer, but the country develops very fast.
Yep.
As long as the government knows what is kind of doing the right thing. But in the case of the other East Asian economies, they transitioned out of that authoritarian mode into very vibrant democracies. And I personally don't think that once China gets a little bit more developed and a little bit wealthier, it couldn't become more like a Singapore or a South Korea than a North Korea. So everybody, the anti-China people in America want to portray the country as like it's like a giant North Korea.
Yeah.
But in my mind, it's much more like a giant Singapore than a giant North Korea.
Yeah, absolutely.
So,
the Chinese, even going back 20 years ago, they kind of laugh at North Korea. They laugh at the Kim family. I study with some North Koreans at Tsinghua, but they're deathly afraid to talk to me. And spend some time on the North Korean border. But yeah, the Chinese, they look back and, Mao is still a hero, but they also realize, like, why did we get into this cult leadership thing? It's crazy. And they laugh at the Kim family, North Korean people buying into that. So yeah, absolutely. China is way closer to Singapore on the scale than a North Korea. North Korea, 1960s China is like history. It's long gone.
Yeah. When I meet with government leaders there, like sometimes I'll be there and for some reason, I'll be at some event or I'll be sitting at lunch, at the event with some government official. I even have relatives on my father's side who are government officials, right? And when you talk to them, they're just like technocrats that might have come from Singapore, actually. Mm-hmm. And the way they think about their society, like none of them are thinking about, oh, I don't like this business guy. I'm going to send the secret police over to his house now and interrogate him or have him shaken up. Like that just isn't part of the mentality there. So the picture that even like JD Vance has of like what Chinese society is like or something is just totally wrong. Yeah. Like it's like there is a legal system there. Maybe it's not exactly like ours, or maybe it doesn't operate as efficiently as it should or effectively, but generally things are resolved through that set of rules. They have a set of rules by which the society is run, and they mostly follow those rules, actually.
Yeah. What I tell people is you feel more free in China than they do the United States, to be honest. So, drove a car there 20 years. I never got pulled over by police. They were stopped at a checkpoint. You basically do what you want, China. As long as you're not hurting anybody, you can basically do what you want. It's very, free society. You're not forced with high insurance bills and high medical costs or high property taxes. It was, the 90s from today was kind of the Wild West from, I'd say, 90s to 2010-ish. It was really Wild West. It was like, just build the businesses, get it done, do anything. Nobody cared. But then after that, they really started clamping down on, environmental regulations and these types of things. But I lived through the Wild West section. Not a lot of people remember too, late 90s, China was it was not as poor as it used to be, but it was still in big trouble. Like when I was at Tsinghua, they had to open businesses. The government didn't have money to send the universities. So they said, go open businesses. So they'd open a telecom company. The military were running hotels. Government said, we don't have money for you. The military opened bars and restaurants and hotels. Eventually they were told to get out of that businesses. But it's also how they developed their massive industrial base they have now, which is very impressive. I would say the world's leader in terms of actual manufacturing capabilities is they did a bunch of joint ventures with foreign companies, the best manufacturers in the world. I used to run a Norinco JV, a joint venture. Norinco's like the Lockheed Martin of China or something. And and
you didn't make assault rifles.
Well, they do assault rifles. They do, weapon, all types of different artillery, weapon systems. But they learned, okay, let's bring in the guys that know how to do forging and castings and stampings and precision engineering and manufacturing. That's how they learned it. So it was really smart where, invite people in, learn how to do it. And then you just can do it yourself. And so I lived through that whole joint venture kind of model, it was quite interesting because I used to visit Chrysler a lot, and I'd go through the second floor, which was the Beijing military section of something was developing their military vehicles, and then the third floor was the Chrysler JV, or at the time it was called Chrysler. But yeah, no, it was interesting. But they went from that to, we used to have too many workers. One of my first job off Tsinghua was at General Motors. They had bought a bunch of facilities, but nobody wanted to go visit these companies. Like, so they send me. I was the young guy. I'd go out to the boondocks, and the boondocks like Hangzhou, right, which is like amazing place now. But back then, everyone considered it like backwoods or something. And I'd look at all these joint ventures, and we would have 800
For
people.
the listeners,
Sorry, go ahead.
For the listeners, that's now the home of DeepSeek,
Yes.
for example, and Alibaba.
DeepSeek.
But yeah, at the time it was a backwater.
Looks like the future. It looks like the future. If you go there, it's just an amazing place. But yeah, back then, all the big executives didn't want to leave Shanghai, basically. They send me out to all these facilities, and I would be in different factories every week, just trying to understand what's going on. And, they would have 700-800 people. They would probably need 100. So we literally had way too much labor in the late 90s in China. There was a huge excess of labor. And then by 2010, what had happened, you'd already started to see the first signs of labor shortages, which was incredible. Like, nobody would have believed that 10, 15 years before. It would be incomprehensible. Because there was a lot of Rust Belt unemployed up in the Northeast. The whole Chinese economy was shifting. And then now you still have China. You have an economic transformation issue. So when we talk about all those people that went to college, now they don't want to work in factories. So you have all the one-child policy. You have all these highly new educated people. How can you shift your economy on a dime to go from, blue collar to white collar like this within a decade? Extremely difficult. I think China's doing their best to manage it. But if the slowdown, the slowdown of what we talk about now in China, I think is basically that. It's how to convert that economic system where your human capital index rises so fast, right? And you're seeing that with these young engineers in DeepSeek and all these other, types of companies. And it's just changed so fast. So there's a lot of transitional things that are happening now in China that have to go forward. But yeah, it was amazing.
Let's spend a little time talking about the joint ventures that you worked on. So I think most Americans are not familiar with what happened. So we have this cartoon campaign, slogan kind of thing. People say that, like, they stole our jobs, they stole our IP. And part of that could be, depending on which party you're in, it could be something like the rich Americans sold out the working class Americans by moving all the factories to China. So this is very complicated and emotional rhetoric around this, but you are at ground zero.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So my understanding is if you worked at the GM joint venture in China,
Yep.
they were forced to do a joint venture. So GM owned half,
Yep.
maybe, or a little bit less than half.
Yep.
And a Chinese, maybe state-owned entity owned the other half.
Yep.
The two parties agreed
Yep.
that they would set up manufacturing in China. There was agreed upon know-how and IP transfer as part of the JV.
Mhm.
GM signed on to it. Chrysler signed on to it.
Mhm.
In return, they got access to this huge market,
Yep.
which for many years until recently was a huge profit center for all of these automakers, including Volkswagen and other automakers outside the US.
Yep.
But the point I want to make is that it wasn't that Americans went there and said, "Oh, we're gonna build stuff here, but we're gonna protect all our know-how."
Right.
It was actually from the get-go an agreement that there was going to be knowledge transfer and IP transfer to the Chinese JV, and that is indeed what happened. Now, tell me if I'm right about that.
No, that's generally right. I think so. A lot of people don't understand. So what historically the companies like a GM or anybody went there originally for was this market access, right? So all the joint ventures we did were for market access. The car makers had to be JVs, but parts makers didn't have to be JVs. I set up a lot of 100% wholly owned facilities in China. I also worked for Taiwanese steel conglomerate. I had 2,000 employees. I was the only non-Taiwanese manager. So I did that all in Chinese as well. So, he spent years doing that. But yeah, so we went for market access, right? They did the numbers, the Chinese car market. Well, we're selling 500,000 cars this year, but just do the math. As they get wealthier, they're going to buy a lot of cars. Sure enough, today, a few years back, GM was already selling many more cars in China than they were in the United States. And we're not buying any Chinese cars. So it always looks at you always look at the market. So China has been very open with their market, unlike Japan and South Korea, which have basically blocked their markets and will, like I always say, Japan won't buy South Korean cars. South Korea won't buy Japanese cars. Neither want to buy Chinese cars. So that gets into that kind of mercantilism, export-led development thought process. But China, on the other hand, foreign multinationals have made a fortune in China and continue to do so. General Motors, I think the last number I saw official reports has made over $15 billion in China. So China eventually became 30 million vehicles at the time. This gets into it is related to what's happened in the US, which is basically what I say, one of the four big geopolitical trends of my lifetime: fall of the Soviet Union, rise of East Asia, rise of China, and the deindustrialization of the United States. These are the four overarching things that have happened. East Asia rise, China, and US are all interlinked. So they didn't steal our jobs. We went there for the domestic consumer market, number one. But number two, when people realized how easy it was to manufacture, the exports started flowing, right? Already by year 2000, I think Walmart was eating up 10% of all Chinese exports. Just, China got so good at, mom and pop setting up this little shop and that little shop. It could be done in days, right? Little guy with a screw machine company just sets it up. Like we talked about the human capital index, they were working in the factory. Next week, they're making that stuff, right? You saw these, in China's today, all these little ecosystems of certain product lines develop. Oh, this little village is known for sunglasses. Next thing you know, they're producing 90% of the world's sunglasses because they've got 50 little companies that have set up making them. So they just climbed up that value chain so fast. So the exports absolutely became a huge thing, but it wasn't all the only intended original reason for going to China. Most of it was like, this consumer market's going to be massive. And then people also forget that half of the trade deficit with China is created by our own multinationals manufacturing in China. So, there's very few Chinese branded products in the United States. There's a lot of Chinese products. It's 80% of everything you touch, but most of it's controlled by the U.S. multinational firms, like the Apples.
Good. Yeah, I want to get more into that in a moment, but I want to get back to this one point of what was GM thinking when they hired you to set up a line?
Oh, it's consumer market, 100%.
And so it's primarily so they could access the China market. Yeah. But then as a byproduct of that, a little bit further in the future from there, they realized, I could actually make stuff in China and re-export it back to the United States. Not necessarily cars, but other things.
Yep.
And the sort of populist line, maybe the MAGA, even though I'm kind of a Trump supporter, the MAGA line here would be, hey, the rich corporations sold out the American worker and replaced the American worker with Chinese workers. Mm-hmm. That fulcrum, where that happened was they went there originally to capture the market. They did explicitly transfer technology and know-how to China. Mm-hmm. China got good at making stuff to the point where the companies ended up re-exporting back to the US.
Right.
But it was, how conscious was this decision? Like if you talk to some guy, maybe you talk to some exec at GM and maybe he has Michigan roots and his dad worked on the line, making Cadillacs or something, did he say this is the smart business thing for us to be doing, but I see this is not going to be good for Michigan in the long run. Did you ever have conversations like that?
I had those conversations. I basically, you could call me a MAGA guy, but I have a lot of practical, more real world intricacies in the whole political stuff, especially with regards to economics and tariffs. But no, I had those conversations as a young engineer because I'm from Michigan. I grew up in a 30-year deindustrialization process, basically what I call a 30-year recession. I saw all the factories close around me in my hometown. None of my friends getting decent jobs. And I'd asked my superiors at the time, what do you think about this? We're moving all our capacity out of the US, and they didn't care. They didn't even think about it. It was, I got to get my bonus. Okay.
Yeah.
So there's a room, there's blame to go around on how the US got to where it is. Number one is, the unionization is not, the union has not helped the US in terms of manufacturing capabilities. It's been a hindrance. From day one, Shanghai General Motors produced higher quality than US General Motors, with many fewer workers in China than US used. Because unionization rules, this kind of thing. It was never about salary, but it's unionization rules. Second thing, at that time frame, people forget, year 2000 to 2016, we had the highest corporate tax rates in the world.
Yes.
Under North Korea, just under North Korea, 38%. So what the multinationals all did was they said, why am if you set up a fixed asset plant and equipment in the US, you're going to get taxed 50%, right? When you factor in everything. Okay. And you've got all these retirees and you've got a unionized workforce. I'm going to go make it in China, run the financial transaction through Hong Kong, and I'm going to pay 0% tax. Every multinational in out of the United States did this. This is, I was kind of shocked to learn this when I was younger. I'm like, you're all running these financial transactions through Hong Kong, and it was the issue even in China, because you would transfer price stuff out of China with no profit, recognize all the profit in Hong Kong, ship it back to US. The US company is a wholesaler distributor. They recognize no profit. So that was basically the game that was going on this whole time.
Not so different from maybe Google, Facebook, Google, Meta, and Microsoft, all their profits being in Ireland or something, right? Like totally fraud,
So
just
it's ridiculous. We
law.
got to get to the bottom of all this tax dodging and get more realistic on where to recognize profits and keep taxes at a reasonable rate where you can manufacture, right? So we push people out of the country, basically. So
okay, but just to make that historical point very crystal clear, American executives in your era were just following obvious incentives. It was like a no-brainer for them to just be like, well, I know my dad worked 30 years at that factory, and I'm sad that my cousin's not going to be able to work at that factory. But the only way we can survive as a company, or the best way we can thrive as a company, is we're going to move the manufacturing to China. We're going to recognize the revenue in Hong Kong. It was like not rocket science. It was almost like this. This is the obvious way to do business. But it ended up hollowing out the American economy.
Yeah, that's what Price Waterhouse would tell you to do, right? That's what the consulting companies would tell you. That was the model everybody was following.
Right.
And as you mentioned with the tech companies,
because
it still goes on. Yeah.
Because there is, if you're an anti-China hawk today, you don't know or care about any of that history. You just say, like, those Chinese guys, the CCP stole all our jobs and stole all our IP.
Right.
That's right. Yeah. It's been morphed into that now.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So
there's a lot of intricacies that, I really hope the US can unfortunately, I don't think we have the people in the US at the top that are conveying all these things, but there's blame to go around. There's win-win situations involved here. If both parts, I'm constantly pushing the G2 concept, which is let's US and China work together. If you look in AI, it's a US-China game. Most of the industries are now, it's for large-scale companies, right? Macedonia is not going to be able to come out and make an EV or an AI, better AI. It's basically China, US, and then maybe Europe can get its act together and catch up. Maybe not. But we need to work, this whole concept of the Thucydides trap, I like to say. Do you realize, like, Athens and Sparta, you can drive between these two cities in 3 hours. Okay. So the point is, US and China, the world's big enough. Let's work together. Let's build mutual prosperity. I think China would understand that US, you have a manufacturing problem. Let's work together. We have, no issue for US to reindustrialize. It has to. We're the only large, we can't be 350 million people and make nothing. That's what I tell people. Like, also, there's a lot of trends, as I'm sure you're familiar with, that are helping all. And what I do today in my businesses is we're focused on reshoring a lot of manufacturing, because what you're having now, the humanoid robotics, which is going to be here by 2030, low cost energy in the US, hopefully if they can keep up with the power generation build outs. The whole story for offshoring is going to be gone. The tax rates are lower, automated 5G connected equipment, and most of this stuff will come back just based on national security reasons. So it's in the process of a lot of it transferring back, but you have to know how to do it smartly, right? Like maybe you want to keep your tool makers offshore and just do final assembly, bring in some labor intensive subcomponents. But the whole tariff thing, like I've been for tariffs for 20 years because, as I was telling people, moderate tariffs, because China's not a free market economy. It's really not. Japan and South Korea block their own markets. So you can't be fully, even Germany and UK have tariffs against you. You had no tariffs against them. So you can't be this wide open economy forever and then everyone else blocks their own markets. You get what you have now in the US, which is hopelessness deindustrialization. Right.
So if I could just recap a little of that for the audience. So I think you are saying that, like, Trump is not crazy when he says other countries are and have been using tariffs against American companies for a long time. Yep. And, a lot of the things he said, like, look, I would just be happy if we just had we'll just mirror what you do.
Yep.
If wherever you are, we'll be there, and at least it's fair. Right. And I think the press, which is still, like, as anti-Trump as it's ever been, like, that message never gets across.
Right.
Trump is reacting to an unfair setup that has been in existence for generations.
The correct concept is there. The execution, I think, was done poorly. So the concept is, Japan imports 1% of their cars, China 0.3%, South Korea 1%. There's a reason that is the situation. If they're all so competitive, why aren't they buying each other's cars, right? So there's tariffs and there's also non-tariff trade barriers. So I can give you some examples in China. This is a real story. You'll never hear this. This is from real experience. I think it was 2003. The China car market started to boom. Government came to us with a letter, no official overhead on it. Here's the plan. You got to localize all this stuff, because the car makers, we were making fortunes on importing components and sub-assemblies and just putting it together. That's not what China wanted, because all the jobs and technology came with building the stuff, right? Not just lashing it and ratcheting it together. So they gave us a plan, like, you localize 60% of the car or it will be taxed as an import. So we set up all the factories. I would spend the next 5 years, like, literally doubling the capacity of the plant I was at every 6 months. So what I call weaponization of the customs. Customs will constantly monitor, why is this still getting imported? They come to you, why do you have to import this? Why can't you just buy this here locally, right? These are the things that go on. So Korea, there was a time if you drove a foreign car, they wouldn't sell you gas. Okay, they're nationalistic. Oh, he thinks he's too good for a Korean car. I'm not going to sell him gas. So that's the reality of the global trade system. You don't find it in textbooks, right? In textbooks, it's very simplified and it works beautifully. But in reality, as I say, you'll only find free trade in an economic textbook. That's the only place it actually exists. So Trump had the right concept. We have to, you can't be a superpower and not make cars. We make 9 million cars last year, the same number we made in 1970. Okay. You can't be a superpower and not be able to make steel, not be able to make ships. You see all this erode into the U.S. defense industrial base capacity, where we have $1 trillion budgets and we can't make anything on time, and everything's 5 times over budget. You're seeing even things we should be leading on, like automation. South Korea's way ahead of us. China's way ahead of us. In terms of, I think you posted a chart on X about robots per amount of workers, right? So I follow the automation in China very closely because I plan to use it for a lot of my plants in the States. It's just incredible what's going on. So, but we've lost the basic core of manufacturing. When you lose that, you can't do the more advanced stuff, right? So we've got to get back to making stuff. So they had the right idea, wrong execution. It's been chaotic. It's been changing. It's mass tariffs. I just had one of my companies just pay the first fentanyl tariff I ever paid. It literally says fentanyl tariff on it, on the documents. That was 20%. But I have a chemical that we import. It's only made in China. It's sold to some of the largest semiconductor makers in the world. and it's now a 200% tariff, and it's not made here, right? The everything, you know, when we 200% tariffed on China, that's 145%, 20% fentanyl, 20%, 24% Section 301 tariff. That is we're gonna have shortages here real quick. We're gonna have mass chaos. So I would have executed the tariff system by HTS code. That's product code. Go start with cars. Cars, sure, 20%. People can switch to American cars. People importing cars can work on localizing cars. That there's a substitute there, but people don't realize how deep the Chinese supply chains are. Okay, 80. You know, when they do trade or manufacturing numbers, they do it in revenue, right? But keep in mind, everything in China's U.S. is 5 times more expensive than China. So
Yeah.
what it
Yeah.
says, 80% of everything you physically touch is coming from China. If you look at it in terms of widgets, how many containers are leaving globally every day? You know, the top 10 ports, I think 8 are in China because they're moving the volumes. So it's not just a revenue game, it's a volume game. You've got, and now we've tariffed everything out of China. It's going to be a disaster.
So
We're going to have issues. So
could I dig into that
Yep.
point? Actually, you've said a bunch of things in the last few minutes that I want to return to,
Sorry.
but this one
Sorry,
I
go
want
ahead.
is specifically I want to drill down on. So if we look at the goods that are affected by the tariffs right now, and
Mhm.
effectively a lot of them, I mean, you mentioned one where there's no substitute, so that's just going to be an increased
Yep.
cost component
Right.
in our process here. But some of them are like stuff that's sold at Walmart may just stop coming.
Yes.
So we have finished goods going to retail that maybe will just disappear.
Yep.
When someone imports something here and they pay X for it, they're generally selling it for 5X at the store.
Roughly. Yep.
And if they can't get it, then the cost to our GDP, our economic activity, is actually 5X, not X, right? China loses X because they couldn't sell it to us. But then all the people who moved it and managed Walmart and Walmart shareholders, they were getting that 5X
Yep.
when they sold it. And that economic activity could potentially
Yep.
go away. So that is actually an asymmetry against the US
Yep.
for goods that can't be sourced somewhere else, right? If the X had to come from
Absolutely.
China, is that a fair analysis
Well,
for finished goods going to
absolutely.
retail?
And I've argued for years the American GDP is a lot of fluff. It's capturing a lot of financial flows. It's it's expensive hospital bills and legal services. And yeah, no, you're right. Absolutely. That $5 item in Walmart that costs $1 out of China, America will lose the $5 GDP if they don't have
Yeah.
to simplify it, if they don't have the item.
Yeah.
And to your point, items are stopping. Container traffic leaving China was down 50% for the last, say, 3 weeks. And now I just saw today the Port of LA is saying this week, 30% decline in incoming traffic. Why is that happening? Because guys that are importers, it's the chaos. Nobody knows. Is someone willing to pay 200% more than they were just paying? Some things you could eat. When it was 25%, you could eat that margin. You could figure it out. You could ask for a little price increase. Even if it's 40%, oh my God, I'm going to have to raise your price 20%, right? But when you get in these kind of levels, it just like shuts the system down. At 200%, like, well,
Right.
I don't know if anyone will pay for that. I'm just not going to order it. I'm just going to wait. They're just stopping.
So the example I gave, finished good that would be sold at retail in the United States, and that Trump in a recent comment said, "Oh, so what? So instead of your kid having a choice between $30 or getting $30 at Christmas, she only gets $2. Not the end of the world." Okay. Let me shift to something else, which is that there's some high value add manufacturing process in the US, like maybe making a car.
Yep.
But some screws
Yep.
or pumps
Yep.
or some significant component
Yep.
is necessary to build that car, and it's being sourced from China, and now it can't come in
Yep.
because of the tariffs or whatever it is. That's hidden from most people. I think most people don't, they can think about Walmart, what's going to happen tomorrow at Walmart.
Yep.
They don't understand how embedded all this is in, advanced manufacturing that we really want to work in the United States.
Yep.
So comment on that, or you could even talk about semiconductors, which you're involved in.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So your point is exactly correct. It's called the golden screw theory, right? If you have an entire $100 million operation and you're missing that golden screw, for some piece of equipment, you just don't have it. It just shuts down. But it's actually much worse than that. To your point, so many U.S. manufacturing is a lot of assembly. It's not real manufacturing anymore. All the hardcore manufacturing, the dirty stuff, the forgings, the castings, all this type of stuff, the stampings is all imported. Most of it from China. The chemicals. China makes 50% of the world's chemicals. We almost make none. Like our chemical production left years ago, decades ago. All of this stuff has to get imported, get put in the manufacturing equipment. Absolutely, you could start seeing, massive shutdowns of. I always say if the China trade ships stop showing up, it could shut the U.S. down in 30 days completely. So that's the non-retail side of it. Like you're absolutely right. Like the manufacturing that is here in the States is fully dependent on it. I gave you an example on semiconductors. It takes 1,000 chemicals to make a semiconductor chip. 1,000 different chemicals.
Right.
Most of those are not made here. They're imported, many of them from China. So, that's why you want to keep the trade open, but you have to, this system's been building up for 50 years. And then to think you can change it just with the stroke of a pen overnight, it doesn't work that way. It's just going to create, and guess what? It's going to be a lot easier to reindustrialize with a decent economy than if you just crash the whole thing down. So I think what Trump has done is they come in and they go and they get the problem. They go to Michigan, they go to Pennsylvania, they look around and they go, what has happened? All our manufacturing's gone. Okay, they look around. Where'd it go? China. Okay, and now they're flipping the card table over of the global trade system just in anger. But we really need to be wise at this point. We really need to take a more thoughtful approach how we handle things. So.
Okay, so one of the main reasons I wanted to invite you on the show is for that perspective. So under the hypothetical that we don't get a negotiated settlement with China in the near term, so say this extends for months and the tariffs stay at this super high level, 100%, 200% level for months, you're predicting basically even like a lot of the core manufacturing that we really care about in this country, even semiconductors, is going to seize up.
Potential to
right?
seize up. I think the first thing we'll see is on the retail side. So when you get 30% less containers coming in, that's just less stuff. So what I always say, if you don't make stuff, then you have to import stuff. If you don't import stuff, there just ain't no stuff. So what happens to the stuff that is here, all the prices start to rise because it's in demand. So I think on the production side, the first noticeable for everything will be the retail side. Production side, they will air freight components in to save their production if they'll pay the extra money if they absolutely have to. So you may or may not see some seizing up, but you're going to just start, it's so chaotic right now. And I deal with all types of companies, Fortune 500s. Nobody knows what to do. Nobody knows what the tariffs are actually going to end up or be. I know I want to get out of China. Oh, I can't get out of China. Guess what? When we talked about, it's not just dolls. Okay. If you want your car repaired, you go almost every AutoZone, O'Reilly, Napa, 90% of the car components are all made in China. Okay. And those are all imported. So even if you want to make those here, okay, just to replace, like take a brake disc, right? If you want to make brake discs and furnish the whole US market, you need 35 factories. Okay. Each one's $100 million. Okay. Start making it. And then when you do make it here, oh, by the way, the price is double. So these are the things, to reindustrialize the US, it's got to be a plan and it's got to happen over time. It can't just be, you can't just wish it into existence,
Right. So now I think what you just told us, that example of, the brake pads or whatever it is.
Yep.
I don't think the average American understands that 90% of the car parts at Napa are coming from China.
Yep.
I'm not even sure the Trump team understands that.
They don't.
But I'm pretty sure some CEOs are pounding down the door to the White House and to Trump's team to tell them this is our future if this doesn't get settled relatively soon.
Yep.
So do you have any prediction for how this is going to play out? Because it looks like the Chinese were playing hardball, though maybe they're softening a little bit. So what do you think is actually going to happen now?
So from the Chinese side, a lot of also people, we make the mistake here. We look at everything, made in China, because we can't make anything. Everything's from China. So we think that's China's economy, right? This is not correct. So 15% of their exports now go to the US. Like I always say, if they lose that, yes, it's painful. Yes, you're going to have individual factories where all their market is US. They're going to be in big trouble. Yes, but we buy everything from China. We're just not going to have stuff. That's going to be much more trouble. You're talking recession versus depression here. So on the US side, I'm like 1 degree separated from some people in the Trump administration. We are pushing some of these narratives in there. I'm sure guys like, I'm sure the big boys, the Apples of the world and things have been, talking to them about this. I agree with your point. I don't think they understand how deep the China supply chain is. They haven't thought the second order, third order, fourth order. They just think, and by the way, the U.S. manufacturers with manufacturing plants are booming. Many of their order books is now 10 years out. Like they have no capacity. They're full. But the cases of that happening, there's just not enough of them. There's just not enough. So it's got to be phased in gradual. So I can give you an example on syringes. I think people realize, oh my God, 90% of our syringes are imported from China. That's a national security issue. So there is one syringe manufacturer left in the US. There's a couple real tiny ones, but there's one large one. Their order book is out 10 years now. I have no capacity. I can only give you allocation because the tariff now on medical syringes is 245%. And guess what? That capacity is also not laying around the rest of the world. It was all in China. So these things have to transition slowly. We could have done, and I know Trump's probably thinking political. I got to do it now. If there's a recession, it's got to get over now before the midterms. He's not thinking long-term because our political system. But what would have been smarter is you could phase in tariffs. Okay, guys, this year it's 10%. Next year it's 15%. The year after that's 20%. That gives the year after that's 30%. That gives everybody the runway, from the planning perspective of these corporations, because you can't just set a factory up overnight. It gives them time to figure out, and it gives them the direction. Yep, okay, I've got to finally reshore this stuff. That would be a much more stable plan. But yeah, I'm afraid how it ends up is we've got a lot of chaos coming, unfortunately. So inflation, shortages, tariff at some point, it's not sustainable. I think both groups will back down. I did hear some positive things on the fentanyl side of it where, they'll maybe get something done on that. But yeah, I'm just hoping we go back to say a 40% range. I think it's survivable if that happens, but the current rate is not.
Yeah. So this is now more of a political analysis, but could Trump come back and maybe it comes down to 40% or 35%, and Trump comes back and says, hey, we put the heaviest tariffs ever on these bastards, and we got them to stop sending fentanyl and killing Americans, and then that's his political win, and then we settle out there. I think that would be viable on the U.S. side. At least the MAGA side wouldn't notice how stupid the whole thing was.
Right.
But the Chinese side might not let him off. That's the question. It's they're talking so tough now. They might not let him off. So I don't know. I don't know what's going to happen.
I have a win-win for both groups. To your point, it's funny, and I agree. Trump could actually declare victory, but with nothing happening.
Yeah.
And people may not notice, right? So, but a win-win
on Fox, they'll just report it as a win.
They'll report it as a win. I see win-wins for both groups here. So let me cover the fentanyl thing right now, real quick. Fentanyl is a cancer drug precursor. It's sold all over the world, mostly by China. I think 70% China, some Turkish, some Indian companies. It goes into Mexico, where the drug cartels mix it with other stuff to make the street drug fentanyl, and then they distribute it in the United States. Somehow China gets the blame for this, which I find ridiculous. It's not the drug cartels, it's China, right? So I had a very easy win-win here. China just says, you know what, Mexico, you're abusing fentanyl that we export to you and cut them off. Okay. China wouldn't even lose a sale because Mexico's then going to go to the US to buy the fentanyl cancer drugs, right? Then the fentanyl, the China can easily just say, guys, that fentanyl's from the US. We don't even export to Mexico. We cut them off because they were abusing it. Okay, done. Not your problem, right? It's a win-win for everybody. The trade side, I agree with you. I think China wants to level some kind of a lesson. I think that, and not only just the tariff duty raise. China has tariff duty raise. They have a 25% tariff on cars, right? So I think if you went sanely to China before and said, guys, we have to manufacture, we're going to put these tariffs on everybody, then you were not excluding them. I think China, you're kind of backing them into a corner. We're publicly trying to get, the Quad around them, India, Australia, Japan. We're trying to create these like World War II type alliances against them. And now we force them into the arms of Russia, which culturally the Chinese and Russians don't really have an affinity there. The Chinese love America. They loved Americans. There's a lot of cultural affinity between China and America. So we kind of dropped that ball in pushing them towards Russia geopolitically. But I think the end of the day, the U.S. could win this very easily. You start selling them chips again, right? I think one of our biggest own goals was stopping chip shipments to China. It's like, why are you reducing the profit of our firms and forcing them to develop competitors? That's all you've done. Because at the end, and I know you're in this field, you probably know, I'm sure you know better than I do, but it's like, it just doesn't make sense to me. Like, why handicap your own companies from the world's largest market?
No, I had exactly the same analysis of this as you, Dan. I think it was a huge mistake. The whole chip war was a mistake by the United States, and it hasn't kept them back because in generative AI, they're just barely behind us, if at all.
Yep.
And now they've got a blossoming, very, very vibrant, powerful domestic semiconductor industry, which was energized by this whole crisis that we engineered.
Yep.
And actually, to be honest, if you were a Chinese nationalist, you would just hope that we just keep this NVIDIA ban on for a while, because Huawei is right there with clusters and advanced technology that can compete with NVIDIA.
Yep.
So now Huawei is going to have one of the largest markets for its AI chips, and NVIDIA's AI chip market goes down by a factor 2 because of something done in the White House, right?
Yep.
So I think on the Chinese side, they'll be like, keep your NVIDIA chips.
Exactly.
Keep them, right?
Yeah. Exactly. So we just gave them short-term headaches, right? So on that win-win side, short-term headaches. On how we win this back is sorry, go ahead.
Not only did we give them short-term headaches, but we also, though, created an alignment between all their companies. So all their, everybody's following their own incentives, right? So the guys who fab the chips, they have to compete with TSMC and Samsung.
Yep.
So the dumbest, easiest thing for the purchasing guy at SMIC to do is buy the same chip making equipment that TSMC buys, which is all Western companies. But the moment you sanction and you say hey, we're going to cut this all off for you, well, then the guy has to go down the street to Haidan,
right,
to his buddy's startup and say hey, does your thing work? Because we got to buy it now.
Absolutely.
And well, if it doesn't work, my engineers are going to help you get it working.
Right.
And that whole dynamic was just triggered under Biden by what we did.
Right.
And they went from very tough for these small companies making semiconductor equipment to break in for the reason I described, to suddenly they are embraced by Huawei and SMIC and all these other companies. So it's insane.
It's funny when you mentioned Haidan District. Funny story. When I was at Tsinghua, to give people the idea, to let you know how much brain power is clustered in this area. That's where Tsinghua and Beida is. The guys out selling the fake CDs at the time, the fake DVDs and CDs, I would take a look at it. And I'm like, what is this? AutoCAD, SQL database. It's all advanced computer software, engineering software,
pirated software.
I'm like, how much is this? Oh, that's a $40,000 site license. Oh, but here's 8 RMB. Okay. But that's how we did it back in the day. We just would, and we learn the systems, play with them, But it was Huawei, as you mentioned, now has a walled garden in the world's largest market. It makes no sense.
Exactly.
We always used to say, in not just tech industries, but auto as well, if you're not competing in China and winning, you've lost. You have to be able to
Yep.
compete in China because it's the world's largest market for everything. It's 80% of the EVs, right? So if you're not in China winning, you're losing not only their market, the consumer market, but the engineering talent, the supply chain, all of this stuff it's just so crucial to be in China, competing there, and trying to, because if you're not doing that, they're gonna leap ahead of us, and then by that point, it's gonna be almost impossible to catch up, I think.
Yeah, it's just a scale thing. I mean, it's the largest 30 million cars a year sold there, as big as US plus Europe together,
Yep.
and also the most competitive, like
Yep.
cutthroat, cutting edge technology competition. And if you can't compete there, you're eventually going to lose. How are you going to beat them in Brazil, or how are you going to beat
Right.
them in the UK, right?
Yep.
You're going to be outcompeted, right?
And we're
So,
seeing global retrenchment by American multinationals all over the world and that kind of thing. Ford sold their car plant in Brazil to BYD. So it's already at the stage where these Chinese corporates are going to take most of the global market share in most everything. I would say our last technical result might be NVIDIA chips, Apple iPhones. So if we lose that, what else do we have? There's not much left. So it's going to be interesting. Sorry, go ahead.
in terms of in terms of cost performance, I would say the Chinese cell phone. I mean, of course, you might just be locked into the iOS ecosystem.
They're better.
But just in terms of like the cost performance of the phones, the Chinese phones are actually better than Apple phones, honestly.
And they're been that way. It's been that way for 10 years.
And they're losing in China. I mean, Apple's iPhone market share in China has been going down.
Exactly.
And that's the most competitive market for this stuff.
Exactly.
Everybody's there.
Apple, I think they have a lot of problem. I mean, 20% of their sales are China, which is declining.
Yep.
And I think still 70% or more is manufacturing. Just got a 145% tariff. So they're in a difficult, and what's the difference between the latest iPhone and an iPhone from 7-8 years ago? I'm not seeing
Not much.
I'm not seeing much. Where you look at the Chinese phones, they're just moving ahead. Like China's an interesting market, as I say. Like it's like a alligator swamp over there. If you survive, you're the biggest alligator in the world.
Yeah, you're Godzilla if you survive.
There's no IP protection, right? People think, oh, they steal anything. So in China, someone will copy your stuff the next day. So they have to constantly be re-innovating over there. Yeah. That's why these companies become so powerful. The Tencents and the Babas and these are just juggernauts companies I think most of the world will be buying BYDs, Xiaomi's, and they're even displacing their own industries. So interesting thing in the car market. Now you've got the tech firms, right? The BYDs, the Xiaomi's, the Huawei's.
Yep.
They're displacing the old state-owned enterprise companies, the SEICs, the FAWs, the Dongfeng. So there's this redistribution there that has to happen where you bleed down those old state-owned car makers and these brand new private companies are coming up. So, it's interesting dynamics. So
sounds like, though, you think, if we, maybe we come off this problematic rollout that Trump just had, we come off it to some more reasonable place. Over time, the U.S. can get some manufacturing going, right? I mean, it's not absolutely too late, is it?
No. So what came with the deindustrialization in the United States, and I mentioned that's the 4 pillars of huge economic change, I think, the last 40, 50 years. One of the 4. What came with that deindustrialization is massive social issues. You see that, go take a drive to Flint, lead in the water, go to, Detroit. Look, God, I tell DC people, go to Detroit sometime if you don't think we need tariffs. 25% of Michigan's on Medicaid right now. Okay. And that's just not Michigan. It's every state. So, how we get it back is, and what I focus on with a lot of VC investors now on reshoring. Number one, you have automation, right? That takes away a lot of the old labor cost issues that were involved with moving manufacturing out. Number two, you've got low cost energy. U.S. has some of the lowest LNG prices in the world. They still though we have to be able to convert that to low cost power generation. If you want to create a prosperous society, you need to be able to create power for the future, for the AI, the EV, all this stuff at 10 cents a kilowatt hour or less, and keep that. You've seen what's happened in England. They're at 33 cents, and every productive enterprise in the world they had is gone. Their last steel mill closed. England's last steel mill closed, and now they're trying to start a war with Russia. I mean, it's the delusion is insane. So how we bring it back is we have low cost energy, we have automation, we now have reasonable tax rates, and the thing. Oh, we don't have the labor is kind of a non-issue for me. I think it's 350 million people. You tell me you can't find 1,000 people to work at TSMC? Of course you can. So there is of course, absolutely, we need to develop our own STEM people. We need the best tier of immigration, especially on the engineering side. Keep that open, but absolutely it can be done. It will have to be done. We were the world's manufacturing power 50 years ago. We were making 25% of the world's chips 10 years ago. So all this can come back. It just our system, when we got deindustrialized, it became set up for financialization. Everything's money printing, debt, buy to lease, private equity focused. The worst thing you can do in a private equity company is spend money and invest it. CapEx. Don't do it. Just go buy it from somewhere, right? It's all about return on investment. So we have also the whole system itself will have to focus back on setting up a sustainable environment for a manufacturing economy, and get our human capital index going back the right way instead of down. So
these are all hard things, and they're going to take time.
Yes.
I just hope our society can commit to a sustained, rational strategy.
Yep.
And these quick wins that this guy Howard Lutnick just I can't listen to this guy for even 5 seconds. But yeah, I mean, that kind of attitude is not going to get us there.
No.
You have to admit that you're in a long-term marathon, and it's too important to lose.
We need someone to explain that, guys. This is not a 2025 thing. This is come out with a 10-year plan. Come out with a 10-year plan. Come out with a 10-year plan and just say this is where we need to be in 10 years. And this is what it's going to take, and get out of the constant political cycles. And both political parties, literally you have whoever's out of power is rooting against the country. What I mean? The Democrats say we'll cheer bad economic growth, we'll cheer shortages, for political reasons. It's craziness. So, hopefully we get it sorted out. I think we need China's help to reindustrialize. I think that should be the focus. Like literally.
Yeah, one of the things Trump said during the campaign, which gave me some hope, is he said, look, these Chinese guys, they can sell their cars, their EVs in America, as long as they build the factories here and also transfer know-how to Americans. Like, that's fair, right? That's turnabout is fair play. And that made me think Trump is reasonable on this, right? So
and that's all what I'm doing now. It's part of my reshoring, the facility, new company that I'm trying to build now. I got the first one going in Tampa to make medical equipment. That is Chinese joint venture strategy, but flip it on its head. Get these Chinese companies to come over in U.S. and invest. Oh, by the way, guys, in U.S., your price point is going to be 5 times what it is in China. You have less competition. Bring the facility over, manufacture it here and capture that market while you can. Right now, China's not getting value for what they make. They'll make something for $1 and it sells for $5. Get the plant over here, sell it wholesale at $2.50. You know what I mean? You're getting double what you get in China for, or triple. So I think that avenue is open if we do it smart. Chinese companies obviously are scared of U.S. now. They don't want to invest in U.S. There's too much tension. But if it's done at the high level, you literally could go with China and say, U.S. needs a remanufacturer. We're going to invite $1 trillion in capital equipment investments from China to the United States. Here's a great example. The pork industry, Smithfield Foods. Have you heard of this company? It's Chinese owned. They own about
Yep.
60% of the pork industry in the United States. They manage 18 million hogs. So keep these ratios in your head. In China, the entire pork industry manages 118 million hogs. Okay, so 118 million versus 18 million. Okay. The entire Chinese pork industry profit is about $1.7 billion. Smithfield makes $10 billion a year.
Wow. Yeah.
Well, it's literally 10x the profit for 10x less management. You see? So because the Chinese market is so competitive and the US market has become these oligopolies, every industry you're in, there's 2 companies, 3 companies. So we need to go also back to the drawing board and figure out how to let 100 flowers bloom. Let entrepreneurs and new manufacturing companies develop, figure out what's blocking that. Is it regulations? Is it capital? And get that fixed. And then it'll take care of itself. The system, the private enterprise system will take care of itself. You just need to, we're like fish. And if you set the fish tank up properly, we'll thrive. But if you leave in dirty water, we're all going to die. So that's how it works.
That's the beauty of the market system. And, the communists, to their credit in China, figured out, like, if you really want to get stuff done, you have to have the incentives aligned. You have to have a free market and let people go, and they'll do it.
Oh, right? Absolutely. I tell people China is much more capitalist than the U.S. People don't get it. They're the best capitalists in the world. But like as I mentioned, they kept a backbone of kind of key strategic sectors. And it's not a free market. I mean, they pump the EV industry full of money. I mean, that's because they saw that as strategic. They want to stop oil imports, as much as they can. So, but the private enterprise system that functions in China is completely, it's cutthroat capitalism.
It's funny because in academic economics, they sometimes argue about this question of, like, well, if you really had perfect competition, wouldn't the profit margin just be driven to absolutely to zero? And China in a lot of areas is just like that. They literally drive the profit margin. They compete so hard, the profit margin is literally zero.
That's correct. Theoretically, if capitalism is done right, margin should go near zero.
Yeah.
Or just enough to keep people alive. And that's what's happened in
which is
Chinese industries.
Yeah.
Yep.
It's crazy.
It's amazing to see. It's very interesting. And that's why they're so competitive, So,
well, Dan, I've really enjoyed this conversation. We're about an hour and 20 minutes in, so I should probably call it. And I'm sure our listeners really enjoyed benefiting from your vast experience. Is there any place you are online that I should point to in the show notes or point people to?
Best place to find me is on X at Dan Collins 2011. Yeah.
Great. I'll put a link there in the show notes.
Yeah. Cool.
All right,
man.
Take care.
Great to meet you, Steve. Yep. Talk soon. Keep in touch.
Yeah, I hope we meet in person someday.